Hi, everybody. Thanks very much. It's wonderful to be among friends. My name is Tristan Goodman. I represent the Explorers and Producers Association. I am an oil and gas advocate. It's, for some parts of the province, it feels a little bit like a confessional at times, I have to admit. But the reality is, look, there actually is nothing I've done that I'm more proud of. The fact is that I represent a tremendous number of people, small entrepreneurs, large independents, those junior and intermediate folks. The vast majority are Canadian, and they produce a tremendous amount of oil and gas for this country. The reality is we are in a bit of a crisis of affordability. And what do we have right now? We have a federal government that, instead of trying to help us as we move through changes, and actually as we sort of work with Indigenous communities and put forward those emissions reductions, we get emissions caps, or really production caps. We have pipelines where gatekeepers are unable to get anything really done. Decades to get applications through. $30 billion to twin a pipeline simply because we are losing out. That's the reality. So it is my great pleasure to introduce two friends, two individuals that have contributed for decades to actually pushing back on what really is becoming, just as Boris Johnson would say, barking mad. It was great, and he actually does use those. I had the privilege of having dinner with him last night, and he's clear. It's just not working. So with that, I would like to introduce two tremendous Canadians, two tremendous people that are contributing to the broad national interest and pushing forward on common sense policies. First, my friend Tim McMillan, former president and CEO at CAP, the Honourable Tim McMillan from his time in Saskatchewan, multiple portfolios, including the energy minister, and of course, someone that really defends the interests of a sector, not to sort of prevent us moving forward on reducing emissions, of which we are, but also to actually try to ensure those good-paying jobs and that great wealth that goes and touches everybody across this country and funds so much, if you look at our balance of trade and other aspects. That is MP Stubbs. So with that, thank you very much, and welcome to the stage. Thank you for all you do.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Tristan, for the introduction, and thank you for doing this, Ms. Stubbs. I think we're going to have a great conversation. We got just under half an hour.
Yes, and you have to call me Shannon.
Shannon, perfect. I am going to set the stage just a little bit for our discussion. It's about lessons learned and the path forward for natural resources. Canada's got phenomenal opportunity across a wide resource base. Some of the lessons learned I think we're going to get into are ones that we as an oil and gas industry maybe should have learned from the forestry industry, who was under attack in the 90s. We largely sat on our hands and thought, man, that looks tough for that industry, but they'll never come after us. We fuel people's homes. We're now 20 years in, and it looks like we're turning a corner. What industry in Canada needs to be thinking about where next, what lessons need to be learned. So I think we're going to get into those conversations. But just timely for today, in the House, in Parliament, the Liberals switched around the agenda and have put you in a position of having to defend Canadians on an issue that I think is very much apropos to what we're going to discuss today. So maybe I'd just pose a question to you as we start this conversation about the Just Transition Bill, kind of what that means. You represent a riding with a lot of hardworking Canadians that I think would be pretty representative of hardworking Canadians in the resource sector across the country. Are they telling you that that's a bill that they're passionate about and that the just transition is something that you should be supporting, or is it the exact opposite?
It's the exact opposite, and I just want to thank you for inviting me, and Tristan for including me in this panel today, and just say how great it is to see all of you movement activists, volunteer conservatives here at Canada Strong and Free. I think I've heard that it's maybe one of the biggest conferences ever, and so you will make the difference in making the change that Canada needs for to bring home a common sense conservative government and help reverse course. I'm so glad that you raised this, Tim. That Bill C-50, the Just Transition, is really the end game. It's really the crowning jewel on 9 years of the anti-energy agenda that has been incrementally implemented against Canada, and of course is now being advanced and escalated by the costly coalition, their backers, their anti-energy backers in the NDP. But it gets right to what I think is really going on in the discourse and the debate around energy development in Canada. It is the conflict between those who believe in private sector development, in private sector job creation, in the free market, and those like we Conservatives who believe that governments should set the rules of the game, should set attractive, fair, predictable, certain investment conditions, and then let the private sector compete, build major projects that get approved, and create all those jobs to the benefit of the whole country. This just transition, though, is a global concept, of course, that's been developed over a number of years by anti-energy activists. And what the NDP Liberals did is, at the last minute, change the name of the bill to call it Sustainable Jobs before they brought it in the House of Commons. And this is why, because it won't actually do any of the things that they say. It's not about creating a job skills program. It's not about actually helping workers. It's about killing jobs, and it's about creating government bureaucracies to central plan and restructure the Canadian economy every 5 years. That's truly what the bill does. And to your point about private sector proponents and all Canadians who should be concerned about anti-development activism, it's very true. Wait until people, really contemplate what actually is involved in, further decarbonization efforts or this push to increase EVs in the driving population. Well, right now, the supply chains, the value chains are all owned by hostile regimes to Canada. Canada hardly produces any meaningful amounts of critical minerals and metals, and Conservatives would work to bring home those jobs, business and development, to own those entire supply and value chains in Canada by Canadian business, Canadian workers for Canadian resources. But when you face activist groups that just want to get to know, social license isn't a thing. When you face activist groups that just want to shut you down, a mutual science and evidence-based middle ground is not a thing. And so I hope that now private sector developers, but especially Canadian workers across all sectors, know without a shadow of a doubt that that's really what the tension and the conversation about energy development is in Canada, which to me is the most significant economic, geopolitical, security, and sovereignty question facing our country and the free world.
Absolutely. Pierre Poilievre was here this morning and gave a great speech to the audience. He had a line that I wrote down. It is, complexity is the last refuge of the charlatan. And I thought, isn't that interesting? The bill that you're just dealing with, they changed the name. No one could really tell you what it means, but the sense is that it's a transition to something far more complex than the most efficient, safest, environmentally responsible industry that we currently have in the world. Canada is the supplier of choice.
Yes, and what's crazy is to see the games on it, which is exactly what tells you that they're lying. Because, of course, the fact is that public polling showed that Canadians, first of all, didn't know what the just transition is, but once they did know, then Canadians said, hang on a second here, we don't like it, we can't afford it, and we don't support policies that governments continue to impose to punish Canadians before bigger polluting countries around the world do their share. Instead, we're sitting here with a federal government that hampers, roadblocks, gatekeeps Canadian energy and Canadian workers. Pierre said to me a couple of years ago, and he's so right as he is in these crucial moments. He said, the Prime Minister doesn't actually have a problem with oil and gas. He has a problem with Canadian oil and gas. And it's like they studied this concept of the just transition, not the Bill C-50 itself, for a couple of years behind closed doors. It's going to set up this plan to create a government committee to create a government committee with 5-year planning cycles. Yep, you heard it, 5-year Soviet-style planning cycles. I don't even have to make this stuff up. And And then, but Canadians don't like it when they know about it. That's why they changed the name.
Rebrand.
Yes, absolutely. It's just a spin job. And then, so they're able to sort of play both sides, where they pretend the bill is something that it isn't. They even have the gall to argue that it's about more job creation, except that it's about a transition. And so when we say, no, you're putting at risk 2.7 million livelihoods across major sectors of the economy, they just come back with this, oh no, we're creating jobs programs. That's not what the bill does at all.
In a country where we have one of the world's largest endowment of oil and gas, where we produce it at a standard higher than anyone else, at a time when the world is using more oil and gas and coal than at any time in its history, it does seem a little counterproductive. But I do want to bridge over to lessons learned. And where are a lot of these policies coming from, I think is important to understand. The Ango movement, I think, has been very active. I think they worked very hard to get integrated with multiple governments across Canada. Much of that agenda I see translating its way through to bills like the Just Transition or an emissions cap or some of the other pieces. On your earlier comment, the conditions that the opposition to the oil and gas industry or forestry or agriculture. We were just having a discussion downstairs with a completely different industry about as soon as you meet their conditions, it seems like their conditions change.
Yeah.
That their objective actually wasn't the condition they put forward, but something different. And I think that's certainly been a lesson that oil and gas has learned, is that it's always incremental, and it's designed for you not to be successful, to not create the next job or the next investment in Canada. And I guess by the consequence, it's to shift it elsewhere.
Yeah, and all of it is barking mad, to your point. It is mind-boggling to face a government that is imposing policies and legislation and taxes on our own country that our major oil and gas competitors around the world are not. And, while India is celebrating ramping up coal and China ramps up coal faster than we can all count, and the U.S. has outmaneuvered us, continue to be our closest ally and our biggest customer, but also our biggest competitor in oil and gas. Like, none of these countries are adopting this suite of policies that the anti-energy liberals have imposed on Canada over the last 9 years, because it's bad for their countries, it's bad for their citizens, it's bad for their economies. That's why I think you were saying that there were some representatives talking earlier about many of the European countries who are way farther down this policy agenda than Canada is, and they're backing it all up because reality is setting in, and people's power bills and their grid alerts and cost for fuel, cost for food. And so those citizens are backing up, and their governments are too. I think that there has to be a realization that this isn't a science and evidence-based equal debate. It is a debate about fundamental economic development and the structure of our economy. And why it's happening is, of course, because the Prime Minister is an anti-energy activist. You'll all remember back shortly after he was leader, I think, remember he said he was going to phase out the oil sands, and then he came out saying he didn't really mean it, and I think many of us thought it was a gaffe. Well, after 9 years, there's not a shadow of a doubt that this is a government that wants to phase out Canadian oil and gas. Every single action shows it, capped off by them ramming through Bill C-50, the Just Transition, which, by the way, because of their procedural tactics, not a single Canadian worker, entrepreneur, Indigenous leader, or energy worker, or business owner, or any Canadian in any sector, in any province, will be able to talk about on record in the House of Commons at all.
Yeah. And we've learned a lot of lessons in the last decade. I think some in industry more than others. I know that we've worked together, representing an opposition to Bill C-69, which was the No More Pipelines Act, Bill C-48, there was a long list. And all the way through, reassessing our approach, what we're doing. I think C-69 was maybe a great example of where we worked together. If some of the lessons is we were too late, that we had too much hope early on, that we would get assurances that, we're going to change this, or we understand. Ultimately, one of the lessons we learned is that, blood is thicker than water. Ideology is an important driver for people that run for public office. And at the end of the day, I felt like that bill was largely an ideologically driven bill, and luckily the Supreme Court has pushed back the other way.
But Tim, like how many months have elapsed and they haven't fixed it. So that law has been an unconstitutional law for half a decade. And by the time it had gone to the Senate and then was coming back to the House of Commons, a pretty unprecedented scenario, every single premier or territorial leader either called for major overhauls or to scrap the bill entirely. They ignored them all, just like they're ignoring them on the carbon tax, just like they're ignoring them on litigation on C-48, just like they lost in court on their crazy plastics as toxins decree, right? They just don't care. And that's because ideology is trumping common sense and the best interests of Canadians.
Yeah, it's frustrating. I know during C-69 maybe as the best example, we got to a point where we needed to be super clear as an industry and be very on the record of what was our concerns and why it was a problem.
Yeah.
From your side, trying to work within the government system as an opposition, I can only presume the clearer industry is, the more helpful it is. If they have a problem with a piece of legislation or an issue, if they're sitting on their hands and talking to you quietly saying, hey, this is a problem, can you fight this on the inside? I'm guessing that's not well received, that you need them to be representing their own interests widely. Is that something that you think our industry or the resource sector in general has largely got their heads around, or are we still challenged at times on that one?
I appreciate you raising this question. So first, let me say that I understand completely the position that private sector proponents in the energy sector and resource development across the country were confronted by this new government that was already giving anti-energy messages. And so I can completely understand that the private sector and their advocacy associations felt the need to take a quiet diplomacy tact, save the furniture. I'm sure that they all went for their first meetings. Well, I have heard that they all went for their first meetings with ministers and with senior public servants. And, they were talking about crazy things like all their successes on innovation and technology, environmental stewardship, Indigenous employment and contracting and ownership, on the economic impact of their businesses, on the unprecedented and unmatched contribution energy companies make to government revenue at all three levels, on and on and on. And then I'm sure that they were told about, and then I understand that the responses of the Liberals who they met with were more along the lines of like, can you please come back and tell me, all about your diversity and these social aspects that they've also mind-bogglingly inserted into C-69, as if like that has anything to do with evidence and science-based regulation of the largest private sector investor in the Canadian economy. But here is what I appreciate you diplomatically raising this with me, because you're exactly right. Private sector proponents and individual entrepreneurs should not have to be partisan. They should not have to be political. But when we are here fighting for workers, local communities, Indigenous workers, all the spin-off jobs and organizations that are supported by oil and gas companies in ridings like mine and right across the country, what is challenging is when private sector proponents or advocates perpetuate the narrative that is actually the driver of bad policies that are designed to shut down their sector, their businesses, and kill jobs. Now, it's not a private sector proponent's job to protect the public interest. It's their job to make profit. It's my job to protect the public interest. And it's Pierre's job, and it's all of us common sense conservatives who are here fighting every single day for the workers in the local communities that we represent. But I wasn't going to name names, but I will. In the debate on C69, the Mining Association of Canada, they supported it all the way until the very end. And I spoke to them multiple times, and I said, well, that's not what like the individual proponents in your organization say at all. They support the carbon tax, they support C69. They've come out, Mac came out afterwards and said, oh yeah, we got it wrong. Right, but it's a little too late, right? So I'll just name, because we're talking about the just transition today, here's an example. The Business Council of Alberta has put out a statement, a long statement, we can get into it, I have it here, talking all about how great Bill C-50, the just transition, is. Well, I looked up the members, the businesses on that business council, and I would suggest to you that if I got in contact with their individual workers, their contractors, their Indigenous partners, and I explained to them exactly what Bill C-50 is and what's it all about, most of them would be appalled that that is what their industry association is saying. And so if it created any waves or people were wondering what our leader at the Vancouver Board of Trade meant by useless corporate lobbyists, that would be an example.
The point you bring about, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but utilizing or legitimizing the agenda that seems to be working against the industry. I know that there's some in the advocacy space or in the lobbyist space that use a technique of adopting the language of our opponents or at times of governments that are putting forward policies that are challenging. And they will reinvent what it means, that a transition, an energy transition means something different to the environmental activist than it does to a energy producer lobbyist that has now adopted the language. But they keep repeating it, and I guess that's a bit of a burn my saddle. I feel like if you adopt someone else's language, you aren't co-opting it, you have been co-opted, and you're just legitimizing that language and actually what it's driving towards. And
I think
I see that too often.
That's right. That is, and I think that in terms of this, the conversation around energy development in Canada in particular, that that capitulation to the language, to the narrative, has helped this incremental advancement of an anti-energy, anti-private sector, anti-resource, and anti-Canadian agenda on our country. So I think that you're exactly right, and it's a thing that, I would say Canadian workers in energy and agriculture and construction, manufacturing, transportation, all of whom are going to be disproportionately harmed by Bill C-50, the just transition, and who are all harmed by that whole suite of anti-energy policies, they should double check like what their industry associations are saying or what the official lines are from from their employers or their employers' partners. And they should put some pressure on them to actually speak truth to power, speak truth to policy, do it consistently, clearly, repeatedly, and don't back down and don't blink, because that's exactly like what the government did on the Energy East application, right? Remember that the government froze all regulatory applications. They announced these vague principles, which, just like the Liberal claim about balancing the economy and the environment, has actually always been what Canada has done, right?
It's the Canadian way.
It's the Canadian way, absolutely.
Totally.
It was long before they ever got here. So they think they act like they invented it. So they froze all of the major applications. They implemented these vague policies for months and months, didn't process anything. And then here you've got TransCanada, for more than $1 billion and all these years in the regulatory system. Clearly they thought there was a business case for that cross-country transportation infrastructure to take Western resources to Eastern refineries and also export to Europe and decrease foreign imports. But what did the government do? Well, they first applied upstream emissions, then they applied downstream emissions, a condition to which no pipeline has ever been held in this country's history. They struck a panel, they fired the panel, they added more conditions, the proponent warned they weren't going to be able to make it, paused, and then finally forced, they had to walk away. But here's this conversation, though, about like accountability and transparency. Here's another maybe beef. Maybe this is like a venting session of like minds. Because after 9 years, it feels like 90. The Prime Minister, he likes to say like about major projects that have gotten canceled because of his gatekeeping red tape and anti-energy policies. Oh, there just wasn't a business case. Well, if private sector proponents don't come out immediately and say, dude, like the fiscal and regulatory framework and regimes in which we have to invest and operate and as we make investment decisions on major long-term projects, the regulatory fiscal conditions set by a government are inextricably linked. They are embedded in the decision of the business case on these big major projects. But the Prime Minister says this, the private sector private sector proponents or industry associations are, being polite in public, and then they get away with this.
Yeah. It's not even being polite. I have seen an erosion over the last several years of, it is now deemed to be political if you are strong on defending what's important to your company or your industry. Like non-political, non-partisan, just this is a good policy for us or this is a bad one and here's why. I've seen that get pushed back at industry as, that's way too political. We can't say it like that. And then you get on this slippery slope back to adopting other people's language and trying to reinterpret it. And I think that leads our nation to a place of bad public policy. It probably puts you in a difficult spot to defend the workers that ultimately are your mandate to defend. And I don't know how we got there.
And the point that you made too about I'm glad you're saying this because people deserve to know. It does happen where private sector proponents will sit in meetings behind closed doors and they'll say, we need to fight this, and the other thing. I could give several examples. Some of them might even be like challenging communications, challenging issues on communications for us to take on, which I never shy away from. But we go ahead and do that, and then out loud, their quotes are being used to attack us, fighting for the best interests of this sector, their workers, and the entire Canadian economy.
And I think that might be a comment that maybe we both should make just to finish this off. We're down to about a minute.
You were watching this time. Oh, okay.
What is a good piece of advice so that 5 years from now, Pierre Poilievre isn't talking about useless corporate lobbyists? Any advice or big picture to help folks along and help Canada and Canadians along?
Well, I think this time around it is to just speak the truth and speak out about policies and about issues. Do that clearly, honestly, and consistently. You can't kind of say on one hand, ooh, we can't talk about some issues because they're political, but then, stand on stages with politicians supporting the adoption of a carbon tax and then, pausing your projects or moving your headquarters into another country immediately after that where your money actually talked, right? So I think the reality is that energy has now become a political issue. And everybody who has a vested interest in seeing a thriving, prosperous, productive Canada with opportunities in the future, maintaining the standard of living that we all enjoy, that we want people in developed countries to also be able to industrialize and also enjoy, which is why we have to get exporting our technologies and our resources so that they can have their energy supply. That is really what this is about. So it would be a mistake, I think, to stay on the sidelines or to be neutral in the conversation, because whether you like it or not, it has become political. And I think this issue is the most important public policy question facing Canada and all of our free market allies.
And it feels like we're at a crossroads.
Democratic allies. Yeah, we are.
We're following the Europe that is realizing they've got a problem, and we are probably not very far behind it.
Well, this is what's totally wild. Like in December, when obviously, as one would, all the wealthy elites flew, even though they could have participated virtually, to Petrostate to tell all the rest of us how to make our lives colder, dirtier, darker, shorter, more inconvenient, more expensive, all these things. Out there, they announced, the self-proclaimed socialist environment minister, should not be saying it, announced the oil and gas emissions cap on Canada. And he bragged that he was the first environment minister in the world to do so. Well, it's not a cause for celebration, that's a cause for pause. The reason no other country in the world is doing it to themselves is because it's bad for their countries. It's bad for Canada, too.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Maybe my one piece of advice I would share from back when I was an elected politician as well is, if you're in the industry, if your interests aren't aligned with the citizens of Saskatchewan, in my case, or Canada as a whole, I think you have to reassess. And to Pierre Poilievre's comment about complexity is the last bastion of the if it's a super complex reason that you're somehow aligned, you're probably not aligned.
Yes.
And get on the right side of Canadians and you'll be in good stead.
Yes, I think that's right. And we have to keep talking about the energy and food poverty crisis, which is an emergency for our citizens and right around the world.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your thoughts with the audience today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim.
So.